This week I saw a couple of things from opposite ends of the spectrum that really struck me. The first is an article by Dinesh D'Souza, who has written a book called What's So Great About Christianity, which is a response to the new atheists like Dawkins and Hitchens and others. And he has an article that came out last Monday called The Atheist Indoctrination Project. And I thought I'd just read you some excerpts about this because it shows, I think, what we're up against. He says, it seems atheists have developed a comprehensive strategy to win the minds of the next generation. The strategy can be described simply: let the religious people breed them, and we will educate them to despise their parents' beliefs. Many people think that the secularization of the minds of our young people is the inevitable consequence of learning and maturing. In fact, it is to a large degree orchestrated by teachers and professors to promote anti-religious agendas. And then he quotes Richard Dawkins. He says, faith, Dawkins says, is one of the world's great evils, comparable to smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. And D'Souza says, well, if religion is so bad, then what should be done about it? Answer, it should be eradicated. But how should religion be eliminated? Our atheist educators have a short answer: through the power of science. The objective of science education, according to the biologist Richard Lewontin, is not to provide the public with knowledge of how far it is to the nearest star or what genes are made of. Rather, the problem is to get them to reject irrational and supernatural explanations of the world, the demons that exist only in their imaginations, and to accept a social and intellectual apparatus, science, as the only getter of truth. Now this is astonishing when you think about the purpose of a science education is not to learn facts about the world, it's to adopt the worldview of scientific naturalism. To think that science is the only arbiter of truth. Well, how is this to be achieved, he says? The answer is simple: through indoctrination in the schools. In his book, Breaking the Spell, Daniel Dennett urges that schools teach religion as a purely natural phenomenon. By this, he means that religion should be taught as if it were untrue. Dennett argues that religion is like sports or cancer, a human phenomenon, composed of events, organisms, objects, structures, patterns. By studying religion on the premise that there is no supernatural truth underlying it, Dennett argues that young people will come to accept religion as a social creation, pointing to nothing higher than human hopes and aspirations. As for atheism, Sam Harris argues that it should be taught as a mere extension of science and logic. He says, quote, atheism is not a philosophy. It is not even a view of the world. It is simply an admission of the obvious. Atheism is nothing more than the noises reasonable people make in the presence of unjustified religious beliefs. So atheism isn't even a worldview on this. Hence, it doesn't need to be argued for. You just indoctrinate it into the kids. Of course, parents, especially Christian parents, might want to say something about all this. That's why the atheist educators are now raising the question whether parents should have control over what their children learn. Dawkins asks, how much do we regard children as being the property of their parents? It's one thing to say that people should be free to believe whatever they like, but should they be free to impose their beliefs on their children? Is there something to be said for society stepping in? What about bringing up children to believe in manifest falsehoods? Isn't it always a form of child abuse to label children as possessors of beliefs that they are too young to have thought out? Now think about what that really means. If giving your children religious instruction is really a form of child abuse, if this is an abuse of their civil liberties, then the state has the authority, the obligation to step in and perhaps even remove the children from that family. I mean, this is really radical stuff if these people were ever to get into power. Dennett says that some children are raised in such an ideological prison that they willingly become their own jailers, forbidding themselves any contact with the liberating ideas that might change their minds. The fault, he says, lies with the parents who raised them. Quote, parents don't literally own the way slave owners once owned slaves, but are rather their stewards and guardians and ought to be held accountable by outsiders for their guardianship, which does imply that outsiders have a right to interfere. That is the state, of course. Psychologist Nicholas Humphrey agreed in a recent lecture that just as Amnesty International works to liberate political prisoners around the world, secular teachers and professors should work to free children from the damaging influence of their parents' religious instruction. Quote, parents have no God-given license to enculturate their children in whatever ways they personally choose, no right to limit the horizons of their children's knowledge, to bring them up in an atmosphere of dogma and superstition, and to insist that they follow the straight and narrow paths of their own faith. End quote. Philosopher Richard Rorty argued that secular professors in the university ought, quote, to arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own, end quote. Rorty noted that students are fortunate to find themselves under the control of people like me, that's a quote, and to have escaped the grip of their frightening, vicious, dangerous parents, end quote. Indeed, parents who send their children to college should recognize that as professors, quote, we are going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable, end quote. And then D'Souza comments, this is how many secular teachers treat the traditional beliefs of students. The strategy is not to argue with religious views or to prove them wrong. Rather, it is subject them to such scorn that they are pushed outside the bounds of acceptable debate. This strategy is effective because young people who go to good colleges are eager to learn what it means to be an educated Harvard man or Stanford woman. Consequently, their teachers can very easily steer them to think a certain way merely by making that point of view seem fashionable and enlightened. Similarly, teachers can pressure students to abandon what their parents taught them simply by labeling those positions as simplistic and unsophisticated. Who said atheists aren't clever? Now, what struck me about that, again, is it's not argument and evidence that is at issue here. If they will engage us on the level of argument and evidence, they lose. But what they do instead is adopt this indoctrination whereby ridicule and scorn and so forth are simply made to look, make religious beliefs look unfashionable and untenable. Now, what is scary as I read it is that I'm used to this on the university campuses. This is not news. This is par for the course. But what strikes me is, where are our elementary school teachers and our high school teachers educated? Where did they get their training? Well, it's at the university. And if the university produces elementary and secondary school teachers that have this same sort of mentality, they don't need to argue against religious beliefs in the classroom. All they have to do is inculcate this scientific naturalism, this different sort of epistemology that says science and science alone is the arbiter of truth, and that therefore religious beliefs are simply absurd. So it underlines, I think, the importance of Christian teachers in our public schools. Any time that we can encourage a young person to go into a teaching career, to choose to become an elementary or high school teacher, we are doing something that will be, I think, of invaluable service to other Christian students as they go to high school and to our culture at large to stave off this sort of indoctrination that de Souza is warning against. The other thing that I saw that seems at first to be the opposite end of the pole is on the editorial page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. An article says, "The flaw of modern religion is monotheism." The flaw of modern religion is that we believe there's only one God, and the professor, Mary Lefkowitz, who is a professor at Wellesley College and the author of Greek Gods, Human Lives, says we need to get back to pagan polytheism. It is monotheism that is the problem. Why? Well, it says ancient notions of divinity have a few things to recommend them, like tolerance. It is intolerant to believe that there is only one God. Whereas if you're a polytheist, then you're okay with many gods and you are more apt to be a tolerant and open individual. Well, now, I am currently reading in my devotional time through the Divine Institutes of the Church Father Lactantius. Lactantius was a church father who lived in Carthage in North Africa prior to the Council of Nicaea, around AD 300 or so. And in his Divine Institutes, Lactantius writes to the Emperor Constantine a kind of defense of Christian belief, because at this time Christians were ruthlessly persecuted. And who were the persecutors of the Christians at the time of Lactantius? Polytheists! It was polytheists that were ravaging the church. And so he writes to Constantine a withering attack upon polytheism, the follies and the immoralities of polytheism. It's an incredible piece if you ever want to see a critique of polytheism. And yet, much of Lactantius's Divine Institutes I found very difficult to read, because the tortures that he describes that these Christians were going through and the bravery that they exhibited under torture are just so blood-curdling, it's hard to read these. He describes how the Christians would be dragged into court and they would be commanded to burn incense before the gods. And they would refuse to do so for conscience sake. They said, I don't believe in those gods. I can't worship and burn incense to these gods. So simple an act as just throwing some incense on the flame. And they wouldn't do it. And so in order to compel them to do it, these Roman polytheists would submit them to the most exquisite tortures. They would rake their bodies with iron claws. And you can just imagine the screams and the crying out that must have occurred when these Christians were being raked with these instruments. And then rather than kill them, Lactantius says they would then tend to their wounds and heal them so that they could get better, so that then they could torture them further and prolong the agony and prolong the torture, so that it was just playing with these people until they would break them down to attempt to get them to burn incense to these polytheistic gods. So the contention of this author that polytheism is tolerant, to anybody who knows the record of ancient polytheism, this is just laughable. In fact, it would be laughable if it weren't so pathetic. I mean, it really is. It makes me angry to think that someone could propound this. And when you look at the record, of modern polytheism, it's no better. Look at India. Oh, think of the Hindu on Muslim violence that took place in India, that rent that country in two and created Pakistan, East and West, and Hindu India. Think of the violence of Hindu on Buddhist believers that is going on in Sri Lanka right now. It is simply not the case that polytheism is a tolerant religion. If you don't believe in those polytheistic gods, you're going to be persecuted, and monotheists have suffered terrible persecution. Rather, what is needed, it seems to me, is not, it doesn't matter how many gods you've got. What matters is what kind of God it is. What is needed is a God who commands you, as Jesus commanded, to love your neighbor as yourself, to love your enemies, and to pray for those who persecute you. It's not the number of deities that matter, it's the moral quality of the deity that matters in terms of tolerance. And that was one of the flaws of ancient polytheism. These gods and goddesses were vicious, bloodthirsty, immoral entities that couldn't care a whit about humanity, didn't love human beings, and the purpose of polytheistic religion was not to love the gods, it was to placate them, to manipulate them, so that you would have good fortune and avoid disaster in your life. On an ethical level, as Lactantius shows, these deities were abominations. By contrast, the God of the New Testament, the God of the Bible, is a God who loves people and who commands us to love even those who hate us and persecute us. It is the moral character of God that matters if you're talking about tolerance. But then the other thing that struck me in her essay was there doesn't seem to be any suggestion here or consideration of what is the truth about God. Whether it inculcates tolerance or not, is it true that these deities really exist? Does she really think that Zeus and Neptune and Athena exist? I mean, what is the truth about reality? That ought to be the bottom line. And this is again where Lactantius is so powerful. His critique of polytheism just makes its folly so evident. He points out that these pagan deities are supposed to be human-like super beings, humanoid kind of deities who have sexual intercourse, who eat, who wear clothes and things. And so Lactantius raises all sorts of interesting questions. He says, if they wear clothes, he says, where did they get them? He says, did they go to the store and buy clothes? Or do they have looms and weave them for themselves? And do they take baths and get body odor, if they don't too much? Where do these gods sleep and go to the toilet and things of this sort? He says, does Zeus have a mole on the back of his right shoulder or not? Does he get an itch and have to scratch his arm sometimes? Well, you just think about these questions. The absurdity just becomes evident to think that there really are these humanoid deities cavorting about in the universe. By contrast, I think there are very good reasons to believe that there is a transcendent creator and designer of the universe who is the epitome of moral goodness and love, and who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. So the bottom line here is, what do you think is really true? Now, that leads me to the final conclusion of her article, which was something I could agree with. Greek theology, that is ancient pagan religion, openly discourages blind confidence based on unrealistic hopes that everything will work out in the end. Such healthy skepticism about human intelligence and achievements has never been needed more than it is today. And I must say, reading her article did inculcate in me a skepticism about human intelligence. To think that a professor at a university could seriously believe this kind of stuff certainly creates skepticism about human intelligence. But then I thought, when you think about it, this must be an intelligent woman. She doesn't really believe that Zeus and Neptune and these gods and goddesses exist independently of the human imagination. For these modern theologians, religion is all a construct of the human imagination. If there were no human beings, there wouldn't be any gods and goddesses. They're not mind-independent realities. They're products of the human imagination, projections on the universe. So she's saying it's better to have this sort of a projection, this sort of a social construct, rather than a monotheistic one. And that, of course, connects with the D'Souza article in the New Atheism, because this is exactly, remember, what Daniel Dennett says religion is. It's a social construct manufactured by human beings, but science gives us a truth about reality. And so I think there's really a kind of unholy alliance here beneath the surface between the new atheism and the sort of postmodernist neo-paganism that's advocated by this woman professor at Wellesley College. So those are just some thoughts on some things in the news. And again, as I say, to keep us aware of what we're up against in our society and in our schools.